Welcome back to Presidents and Politics. I am one of your hosts, Caleb McGee. I am a professor here at Southeastern University, and I'm joined by my fellow host, former Congressman Ross. And today we're going to talk about John Adams as we continue our series on presidents and politics. Now, John Adams, Dennis, is really interesting for many reasons, one of being he's really the forgotten founding father.
Which is really unique, but when you think of the quality of humility that's so necessary for effective leaders, John Adams, his legacy is that humility, because we have kind of forgotten him, but without him we would not have the details of history. We would not have so many things. Massachusetts wouldn't have their own constitution that he drafted. I mean, there's so many things that John Adams did that he didn't get the recognition for, but yet without him we wouldn't have had the solid foundation that we have in our country.
Yeah, we were talking about David McCullough before this started. David McCullough calls him the forgotten patriot, right? Yeah. There are no currency with Adams' face on it. There's no monument. In fact, he's one of the few founding fathers there's no monument to at all. Like, he is a forgotten type of figure. And I think one of the reasons possibly why that may be is because he was in many ways in the shadow of Washington, right?
Very much so.
And everything that Washington was, Adams was not.
No, and even in physical stature.
Absolutely.
I mean, here you have this diminutive, little guy,
yes.
robust, short guy,
yes.
Balding,
yes.
And who almost has a chip on his shoulder, but he's in the shadow, literally,
yes.
of George Washington. Serves as his first vice president, serves as the first president of the Senate,
yes.
and calls it the most useful job in the country. She was speaking truth back then, probably, but
yes.
It's interesting because we say he was forgotten, yet look at. There are no monuments, and yet he was an abolitionist. Mm-hmm. He's one of the few, if only, founding fathers that didn't have slaves because he did not believe in it.
That's right.
And we should be relishing that now.
Yes.
We should be recognizing that.
Yes.
We should be saying, hey, look, here's a stalwart that was so integral. In fact, there was a debate between him and Jefferson as to who would write the Declaration of Independence.
Yes.
And they both wanted each other to write it, and finally, Jefferson agreed to do that, although John Adams did review it afterwards. But I mean, these are significant moments in American history. And when you look at the quality of his upbringing, he was a school teacher.
Yeah.
He was self-taught lawyer.
Mm-hmm. Dad was a farmer.
Yes.
Mom was probably illiterate more than likely from what
Yep.
we know. And his dad, if I'm not mistaken, fixed shoes on the sides. He was a farmer and a part-time cobbler.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. And he comes from this background, which he's such good friends with Jefferson. Well, through most of the time. And then, of course, there's a whole fallout. But up until this point, how much different could you be between Jefferson, who Jefferson says his first memory was being carried on a pillow by house servants. And then you have Adams,
who was a hunter, who was a farmer. Yeah,
and Dad fixed shoes on the side.
Yeah.
But
self-taught.
Like you said, the physical stature is maybe part of this. He did have kind of a stick chip on his shoulder, right? He's small.
True.
You look at pictures, he looks like a little cherub. Remember, like my grandma had the Precious Moments? He looks like a little Precious Moments. And I think that really made him internalize the reality that if he was going to be something in life, he had to use his mind. And I would say he's probably the most brilliant of all the presidents we had.
I would find it hard to disagree with you. And not only that, but he was the least political and the most passionate, I think, about the future. And he looked long term.
Yes.
But also as a lawyer, he believed in the sanctity of the law, he believed in the rule of law, and he believed in the independence of the judiciary. And even though he was one of the original Sons of Liberty that was sparking the revolution, he agreed to represent the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre, which was a reputational risk on his part.
Absolutely.
But because of his belief in due process, because of his belief in a fair trial, he represented the British, the soldiers.
Which is amazing.
It was amazing. And he was ridiculed, he was denigrated, and he acquitted 5 of the 7, or 7 of the 9, I think it was. It was amazing. And then he went back to doing what he believed in, which was the fight for independence.
Yes.
Where do you find that type of character today? Who truly takes self-interest and puts it on the side and looks at the greater good and the foundation upon which we are going to build a better nation.
Yes.
I mean, John Adams got it, he knew it, and he lived it. And yet we forgot it. And that's why I think this podcast is so important about John Adams, because he was one of the most significant players in building this country.
And I like that you said he was probably in many ways the least political, and I would agree with you completely on this. And in many ways, correct me if you disagree with this, I would say in some ways he was distrusting of politicians.
Oh yeah, and I think he got that from Washington.
I agree.
I think his feelings for Washington were so strong that he believed that Washington was right about political parties,
Yes.
about trying to keep the politics out of things, and Adams, unfortunately, in his re-election bid, was the victim of severe and
Slander.
Slanderous, yes. And I think I saw the quote that Thomas Jefferson charged that Adams was a hideous hermaphroditical character who smuggled prostitutes into the country from England and planned to marry one of his sons to a daughter of King George III to establish a royal bloodline. I mean, this is the campaign.
And you can almost hear paid for by the campaign of Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And then the Adams supporters said that Jefferson was a coward, a French radical, an infidel who would seize this country's Bibles and allow the refuse of Europe to flood American shores. I mean, guys, this is nothing new, okay?
Absolutely.
It was vicious back then, and
Yes.
that was the start of the political parties.
Yes.
Adams was a Federalist. He believed in a strong central government. Jefferson was a Democrat-Republican, and he believed more in states' rights, and that's what started to divide. And then that presidential election, how close it was, and it went to I don't know how many ballots. You probably know better than I do, but that's what changed the course of how we campaign for president.
Yes. And it's funny how it doesn't take any time at all. I mean, Washington, of course, he's in control of the military for 8 years and then the president for 8 years. So for 16 years, you've had this man of dignity hold the office, right? There's a word that's used to describe him that I like called gravitas.
Yeah.
And we need some people of gravitas again.
I agree.
Right? Like we really, really need some people of gravitas. And then we go from Washington, after almost 20 years of his leadership, to the first time having a legitimately hard-run election. Because nobody's really going to run against Washington these first two times. So the first time we have a legitimately hard-run election, and already you have the mudslinging. Already you have the divisional politics. Like at the very inception of what this two-party political system is, it got nasty at the very beginning. You hear people like, well, it hasn't always been this way. It pretty much has always been this way.
It always has been this way, with the exception of Washington.
Yes.
It has always been this way.
Yes.
Now, does that make it bad? Does that make it? No. Look, we can make it better.
Agreed.
And I think that's what Adams was trying to do, and yet he found himself falling victim to doing the same thing that Jefferson was doing to him in a slanderous type of way in order to gain favor of the electors. But, John Adams, what I think was amazing to me was the memorialization of history through his letters to his wife, Abigail.
Yes.
And you can't ignore how significant and how impactful that has been to historians and to us understanding that period of time in our nation. And I know you've probably got several of those letters there. And
I do. Let me read one as you talk. I love, as you said, you get to see history through his eyes, and then through his wife's eyes, they correspond back and forth. And it's really probably one of the most beautiful love stories in American history, right?
Absolutely.
It really is.
Absolutely.
They call each other my dearest friend back and forth. And they have this beautiful marriage, this really healthy marriage. Adams is away from his wife a lot because he's in France doing diplomatic work, and he's in London doing diplomatic work. And they're riding back and forth. And basically, kind of like Washington, all he wants to do is to be back home. And he says, basically, that quote from Plato last week, that those who don't desire power are the ones most fit to hold it. That's what we see in Adams. But Adams talks about, I think this is really interesting, when the Declaration of Independence is signed. So you get to see him pinning back to his wife. Now, obviously, you and I know it was really the second day of July, not the 4th of July, but that's beside the point. And he said this: the second day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, with games, with sports, with guns, with bells, with bonfires and illuminations to the end of the continent to the other, from this time forward and forevermore. You will think me transparent with enthusiasm, but I'm not. I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration. 100 years later, the Civil War. He was forward-thinking, as you already said, and support and defend these states, yet through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is more than worth all the means, and that posterity will triumph in the days of transaction, even though we should rue it, which I trust to God we will not.
Isn't that very powerful? What's amazing to me is that the revolution hadn't really started yet.
No.
And they were taking on the most superior army in the world.
And Navy, by far.
And they had neither. And here he is saying, 100 years from now, this will be still celebrated. And it's like, man, you haven't even gone out there. How can you? I mean, his faith, his confidence, his belief in a greater nation that was a democracy that allowed people to be involved in was just amazing. And it's like, come on, John, you're just some guy from Massachusetts, and you're taking on King George.
Yeah.
Who's already got his armies over here in Boston and surrounding Philadelphia, and you think you're going to do this? It didn't matter to him.
No.
And then throughout the whole Revolution, him and Abigail, 1,100 letters?
Yes.
Amazing.
Yes.
I think there were only 3 they found between Martha and George Washington.
Yeah.
And you look at it today. I tried this when I was in both the legislature and in Congress. I would try to, at one point I would write a postcard. I had prepaid postcards, and I would write to my wife what we were doing that day, and I'd drop it in the mail to her.
That's cool.
And then email came along, and I was doing that. But every now and then, I didn't communicate near as effectively as John Adams did. But I found that it helped me understand better what I was doing and what was going on. And I felt somewhat more relieved that I was at least letting others know the way things were. And I would love to see that more often.
Yes.
I mean, that intimate discussion lays a better foundation for what we were and what we can become.
I like that.
And John Adams did that. To this day, I still keep a journal since I was a freshman in college, not near as well as that, but still.
Well, who is as eloquent as he was?
Yeah, you're right. And yet, he is still one of the most forgotten.
Yeah.
He didn't even, he wasn't, him and Jefferson, neither one were at the Constitutional Convention because I believe he was over in Europe and Jefferson
was London at the time.
Yes,
where
he was in London.
Mm-hmm.
And then, his son becomes president too.
Yes, which would be if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong here, it's the only happened twice. It was the Adams and then it was the Bushes.
Correct.
And I don't think we've ever had it since then.
No.
Throughout any American history. So,
yeah.
And I believe it was McCullough that actually spoke about that when Adams heard that his son was elected, he's an older man now, that he actually began to weep in his study because not only was he proud of him, but he knew the trials he would face.
Yeah.
How interesting. Like, can you imagine as like a dad and you've walked through these slanderous attacks and these battles, and then your son takes up the mantle and you're excited, but you also know that in many ways the hell they're going to go through. And that changes the perspective of really the way that you celebrate with them.
Yeah. But in McCullough's book, he talks about, I remember this passage about him talking about going to Germany, to Prussia then, and taking his son, John Quincy Adams, with him on the boat and how they were tossed about and whatnot. But he exposed his son early on to, I think, the benefit of international relationships. Yes. And I guess, I think it was his son was the first ambassador to Germany. I'm not sure.
That sounds right.
But he wasn't force feeding him, but he was giving him a front row seat.
I like that.
To the leadership of this country, and then again, as you know, what happened? John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson have their own. That's a whole nother podcast at another time.
Yes,
that campaign, but John Adams, to me, I try to think who is the John Adams of today, and I don't know if I can find anybody.
That's good.
And it's good, but it's not good.
Right.
But
it's a challenge.
It is a challenge. And again, I think that's why David McCullough was so brilliant in his book about him, because he realized how important this one person was to the development and how necessary we are to have somebody of this day and age like that.
Yeah.
I mean, humility to me is one of the greatest qualities any leader can ever have.
Agreed. It's one of the marks of spiritual maturity, I believe.
Absolutely. And John Adams, even though him and Jefferson became mortal enemies after the election that Jefferson won, they eventually patched it up.
They did. About a 10-year stint, they became enemies, and then patched it up at the end, became very good friends. One of the things we keep talking about is his mind. He was brilliant. He had a personal library of about 3,500 books, which was massive. We have to remember there's no digital books. There's no Amazon to buy things from. Like, you're importing books. They're expensive. This, of course, as you know, is what cost Jefferson his fortune, was the amount of books. Well, books and fine wine, really. But nonetheless, his fortune was pretty much spent on those things. So these are expensive. He's got 3,500 books. And as we look at them, almost every one of them have been read and had like notes in the margin. He spoke and read fluently Greek, Latin, and French.
Isn't that amazing?
Yes. So this is why, as we talk about, in many ways, he's the opposite of Washington. Washington is like this powerful man, this athlete, but he's blue collar in many ways, right?
Yeah.
He's this blue collar mind. And Adams is more of a white collar mind. He's reading like Cato, and he's reading Suetonius, and he's reading Thucydides. I mean, he's reading them in the classic Greek and Latin. But because of that, they have very different demeanors in the way they carry themselves.
Yes.
And I think they're respected differently. Washington was respected and somewhat feared by men. And maybe Adams at time was overlooked by men.
I think you're right. I think because of the machoism maybe at the time that here was Washington, who was the commander in chief that won the revolution, that really portrayed man as a dominant force, and here was Adams, the intellectual.
Yeah, absolutely.
And saying, okay, now that we've gained our freedom, where do we go from here? Let me lay the groundwork. Let me pave the road through, and again, he shows a great example in 1780 when he drafts the Massachusetts Constitution that is still in effect today.
Yes.
That was the framework for the United States Constitution. I mean, this was a guy that really looked at all the what ifs as history would remember him and say, well, this happens and this happens, and we have to make sure that we preserve this. You know, he was the father of the American Academy for Arts and Sciences.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean,
he was a Renaissance man.
He was very much a Renaissance man.
Yes,
and he was very devout in his faith.
Yes, he was.
You know?
One of the things you said, and I want to pick that apart a little and comment on that. One of his quotes was, "I must study politics and war, so that my sons may have the liberty to study mathematics and philosophy." And I like what you were saying, that here's Washington, like the sign of manhood, and he's put there during the time of the Revolution. I don't think anyone else could have held that post. Like, Adams could have not done that.
Oh, no.
Like, at all.
No,
right?
no. We don't need the nerd leading the army. No.
I mean, can you imagine this? What are you going to do, like, quote Cato in Latin to him?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
That's not going to work. At the same time, Washington could not have held the post when Adams did. For example, think about the XYZ affair. Adams kept us out of war with France. At a time when we probably couldn't have beat France, specifically not on the water. Washington already wanted to come out of retirement and go back to war. You see the mind of Washington. He's like, strap your guns on, it's time to go, right? And Adams like, no, we're not going to war again. And it reminds you of the providential hand of God. God raises up a leader for every time. Washington was the leader that had to be there in 1776 and so forth. Adams is the man that had to be here now. And you can almost see God supernaturally raising up those leaders for exactly the time.
Yeah.
And you couldn't have crisscrossed them.
No, they couldn't. They're not interchangeable.
No.
They were for the right time, the right person. And you know, and diplomacy really came to fruition through Adams.
Yes.
And I think that's where his intellect really became contagious to others. Obviously, the politics got involved, and he lost to Jefferson. But you know, as we talk about Madison and those down the line, you know, that were also highly intellectual, I think Adams was the source of at least their inspiration for their passion for this nation and building. You know, one of the things he had issued a presidential proclamation calling for a national day of fasting. Imagine that happening today.
Oh, man.
Imagine that.
Can you imagine the media's response to that?
Oh, my gosh. You know, we do have a national day of prayer, and I've attended that when I was in Washington, D.C., and I think that's wonderful. And thank God we still do that.
Yes.
But, you know, here's a guy who understood his mortality, who understood his spirituality, and he also understood the divine intervention that happened to create this nation.
Yes.
And that was also a groundwork that was laid by George Washington, followed thereafter by many of our presidents. And we just need to have the discussion as part of our American history that this actually happened.
Absolutely.
We don't need to ignore that. And if we want to debate whether this is true or not, you know, then let that debate go on. But let us not forget it. Let's not forget that these founding fathers were strong in their faith.
Yes.
I just like Adams because he's that guy that you just got to rub on the head and say, okay, you know, go over there and take care of this, John. We're not sure what to do, and he would take care of it.
Yes.
You know, I mean, he was a strong family man.
Oh, very much so.
But he was the right guy at the right time. And it's amazing we don't have any monuments to him in Washington, D.C.
I want to touch on the idea of faith because this is debated a lot about Adams because as a later man, he claimed to be Unitarian, right? And everybody jumps on that. It's like, well, he wasn't even really, you know, in our terminology, saved. However, his understanding of the Word of God, his understanding of Scripture is pretty evident throughout. He's often misquoted as saying, and I want to read the full quote so we get an understanding of this, 20 times in the course of my late reading have I been upon the point of breaking out, this would be the best of all possible worlds if there were no religion. People stop there all the time and they go, see, Adams did not want religion. That's not what the full quote actually says. He continued on and he said, without religion, this world would be something not fit to mensch and polite company. I mean, it would be hell. So here is Adams, and yes, at times it seems like he got disgusted with maybe the politics of religion, maybe the infighting of churches, and I think we can all agree with that.
Oh, gosh.
Right?
When you have, 10,000 denominations, you think you're going to have a little conflict every now and then? Yes.
Exactly. But here's Adams, and he says, but if it was not for religion, if it was not for a solid faith, this country would turn to hell.
I think he was spot on back then, too.
Yeah, and he described himself, I believe that the terminology he used was, I am a church-going animal.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting terminology to use.
Yeah, it is.
But that's the way he described himself. So no doubt he was a man of faith. We can debate over the orthodoxy of his faith, right? But he was a man of faith.
He was a man of faith, and he was the first one to live in the White House.
Yes.
For only 4 months.
Right, yes. And correct me if I'm wrong, but on the mantelpiece, I believe I wrote this quote down, it is inscribed, and has been continued to be inscribed in every presidency as they would redo the mantelpiece. It is inscribed, may none but honest and wise men ever rule under the roof of this house.
It is there. I have seen it many times.
Yes.
In the state dining room.
And I like that it starts with honest.
Yes. You know, again, him and his wife were a tremendous team. You know, at the time, women didn't have the right to vote. You know,
right.
I mean, it was just, but he relied on her so much for not only inspiration, but encouragement. And she was a very wise woman, and in her letters in response to him, you know, I mean,
she had a keen mind.
She had a very keen mind,
very
and
much
he relied on her
yes.
Guidance and
yes.
counsel. And that's what we need. That's, you know, we still have that in some instances today, but we need to promote that. Yeah. We need to encourage that between couples that are active in leadership roles, because there are so many sides to everything. And I think Adams did his best to divorce the influences of subjectivity and to focus almost entirely on objectivity without emotion, so that he knew that there would be a process by which a nation could continue to build and resolve many differences.
I like that.
But, you know, again, as an abolitionist, he knew that slavery was never healthy for this nation.
Absolutely.
But he also knew that given the right framework, that it could eventually be addressed very painfully as it was, and then resolved. Yes. We still have many of these problems today, but the framework that was put in place by somebody of the nature of John Adams has led us to be considered still by far the greatest democracy known to man, democratic form of government known to man. I agree.
And I believe the framework that is in place, the framework doesn't need to be changed. The framework will help us still deal with some of these issues that are around today.
Absolutely.
There are issues, right? We would have to be daft to say that there were not issues. There are issues that we still have to work through, but those issues can be met through the government structure that we have.
Absolutely. And, you know, to think that John Adams, again, put his own personal self-interest aside and looked at the greater good. How many times do we want to see that? I mean, I would love to see a presidential candidate or any elected official say the greater good demands this, and I will put this my interest aside to do this.
Yes.
And they're out there. There are those leaders out there.
Will they ever be elected in this time?
That's the age-old question.
Because
right now.
people elect people that are like them,
and people elect people that are going to give them something.
Oh.
You know, I mean, the government largesse has been the greatest thing for people to want to have a reason to vote for somebody. You know, what's in it for me?
What was it that the Romans used to say? Give them bread and circus.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, well, in modern day times, food and free Netflix.
Yeah, you're right. You know, a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage.
Yes.
You know, I mean,
yes.
What's in it for me? Why would I vote for you? And now, we're going to eliminate your student loans. Well, then I got to vote for you because I have student loans. Well, that's, it's
yes.
Adams would be the one that would say, hey, wait a second. Mm-hmm. This is what's called tough love.
Yes.
This is parenting.
Yes.
This is what you need, not what you want.
Yes.
And that's where I have to be as a leader and say, this is better for everybody, and I'll take the heat for it.
Well, I like what you said, and I think this leads directly into what you said. He was future thinking.
Very much so.
It wasn't just about me, it's about them, my children, and their children. And I think one of the problems we have in the 21st century is we think about us. Instead of saying, how's this going to affect my kids and their kids, am I establishing a sustainable, functional government that's going to get better with time, or am I milking it now and going to make it worse in time?
Yeah.
And that takes forward thinking. And I liked to back up another thing you said, I really, really like this, is you said he had a healthy relationship with his wife. And I think about this. I think that healthy couples create healthy families create healthy men, and healthy men create healthy leaders.
I agree with you.
We need that again.
Well, we do.
Right?
We need healthy men and women to be our leaders.
Both, absolutely,
Yes.
because we need both. And healthy couples produce both, healthy men and healthy women to be healthy leaders, right?
It's a great balance.
It is.
I've been able to live it. I've been very fortunate with that, and I've witnessed it in others too. And I think that the Adams family, for lack of a better way of saying is, laid a great precedent for leadership couples
and
to
I
follow.
agree. I'm only 5 years into my marriage, but feel the same way. I'm so blessed, and I would not have accomplished what I have accomplished if it was not for my wife. And I think you're right, and I think that's something that's missing in a lot of times in today's politicians.
Well, I'll be in 40 years in just a couple months. So, and I will tell you that I've been very blessed, although I've stress tested it many times. But I can only imagine how John Adams relied so heavily on his relationship with his wife.
Yes.
Because you find that solace, you find that peace, you find that inspiration in knowing that you have that relationship.
Absolutely.
It can be a competitive relationship, and I'm sure theirs was a competitive
Yes.
relationship, but it was also a collaborative and cooperative
Absolutely.
one. And that is evidenced in their writings. And
They
thank
challenged
God.
each other.
They became better because of it.
Yes,
And our
agreed.
nation gained the benefit as a result.
Let's move a little bit to what made him so unpopular and what absolutely cost him the election, and that's the Alien Sedition Acts.
Mm-hmm.
This is the downfall of Adams in every way. And honestly, everything we've said so far was who he was. And this is where he kind of gives into his ego, right? Because the Alien Sedition Acts are basically saying if you speak against the president,
Yeah,
we're going to come
put
after
in jail.
you.
Yeah.
And if I wrote the stat down, what was it? 26 individuals who were prosecuted. The majority of them were editors of newspapers who were rivals of him.
Absolutely.
You're going after a free press. Come on, are you Mussolini now? I mean, what is going on? And this makes you wonder about the whole debate right now in politics, because this is president of politics, but both. When you look at the idea of how much free speech is going to be allowed in social media and other platforms, it makes you start to wonder about this idea of the First Amendment rights and of free speech, and how far do we go to begin restricting speech, or should we at all?
Well, I think that for as brilliant and as incredible as he was as a leader, he was still a fallible man.
Absolutely.
And I think that, in the old adage, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. A lot of mistakes have been made by many presidents, by many leaders, even
good
modern
ones.
ones. Yes, including him.
Yes.
And I can see how the temptation gets there. I can see how you submit to it because you're looking at, am I going to be around? And I don't believe in what they're saying about me, and that needs to be stopped. How do you do it? Well, you're president. Get the Alien and Sedition Act.
pulpit, right? It's Roosevelt called the bully pulpit.
And it can be very effective, and we see that today still. And you're right, that was the downfall of John Adams. But I think it was also, a confirmation that we're never going to have the perfect leader, in our government. We're all susceptible to this.
Yes.
It's a question of how we address it.
Yes.
And
And the need for checks and balances.
absolutely. And I think that's where you see that God was really involved in the design of our country, because he knew that if we allowed one person or one body to be in control, it would destroy itself very quickly. But having each one being accountable to each other in order to avoid, succumbing to temptation through this checks and balances, we would have a nation that would sustain itself. And it has continued to do so.
And the Alien Sedition Act did the exact opposite of what he wanted.
Yes.
Instead of keeping him in power, it pushes him out of power and just throws the presidency to Jefferson. And if you think historically about the pendulum effect, right? America's always in a pendulum effect. We're always swinging from side to side, and we can never stop in the middle for some reason. We always have to keep going, right?
We can campaign on it, but we can't govern it.
keep swinging
You're right.
out, and I don't know why we can't find that middle and kind of slow down and stay there. The further left we swing, then the further right we swing. The further right we swing, the further left we swing. And before long, we've got to be able to start slowing that pendulum down a little bit, because all we're doing is feeding fuel to the other side anyway. As soon as he does this, the Jeffersonian Republicans come into power with glorious applause, right? And I think we've seen that throughout America's history.
Absolutely.
The right's in for a while, we love them, then they start doing things people don't like, and the left gets in, and we love them, and it's just this constant swing back and forth. However, political scientists tell us that's what makes us healthy. They say if there's not a full change of power every 10 years, then it's not a true free government anyway. But from your experience in Congress, how do we slow the pendulum down some? How do we find that middle ground so we're not constantly swinging from one side to the other?
Well, I have deliberated this many times with many people, so there's no real silver bullet, but my immediate answer would be that we need to demand more consensus from our leaders.
I like that.
And what I mean by that is that we find to ourselves associating with people of like-mindedness.
Yes.
And the more you associate yourself with only like-mindedness, the more extreme you get.
That's right.
That's what leads you there.
That's right.
And yet, when you look at a marriage, when you look at a business relationship, these relationships are not all in agreement on everything.
That's right.
There's controversy, there's difficulties, and unless you address those controversies and difficulties, you're not going to resolve those. So you have to find consensus. And I think we, as an electorate, as the people, the citizens of this nation, we need to demand more consensus building, bringing our sides together. Because the polarization that has continued to divide our country since its inception will lead us to, I think, an absolute collapse over time. And if we're not going to do it financially, we may do it politically.
Agreed.
And so, when I was in Congress, we had some interesting times. Everything was political. We weren't even allowed at one point. The leadership didn't want us co-sponsoring a bill with a Democrat, and I disagreed with that because no one party has a monopoly on good ideas.
That's right.
We, the citizens, the ones that are empowered by the Constitution, need to demand that we seek consensus-building leaders. It's we're the consumers. We want the best product.
Yes.
Don't tell us what we're going to have. We want you to give us what we know we need to have, and that's a good government that can work across the aisles. It's okay to have.
As you said, compromise is not a bad word.
No, look at the Constitutional Convention. My gosh, the great compromise there that
right?
what was it, Richard Sherman gave. Compromise has been the basis upon which we've resolved just about everything.
We have to have win-win contracts. In this sense, I always tell my classes when we study war, we look at the unconditional surrender of Germany in World War I, and it led to World War II. If you come up with something where one party loses and loses greatly, then there's going to be a greater conflict in the future.
Absolutely.
We understand that in military. I think it was Colonel Tim Collins, really famous for the North Irish Army during the 9/11 attacks. And he made the statement, if you are ferocious in battle, you must be magnanimous in victory. And I like that, and we understand that from a military standpoint, but we need to understand that also from a political standpoint. Like, if we dominantly win, can't we be more magnanimous to try to pull the other side over instead of just, crushing them when they're down?
It was Lincoln. There was. Again, another podcast, another time. But he was magnanimous. He essentially, exonerated the South of any crimes in order to bring them back.
And did not demand an unconditional surrender. Allowed Lee to come in with some demands for the freeing of his men and other things. Did not demand just basically we're going to put the boot on you.
And oppress you for the rest of your existence.
Absolutely. I want to come to kind of tying this together as well. One of the quotes that Adam said, and I really like this: "Liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people." And what Adams was saying here, and I want to hear your thoughts on this too, is that a democratic republic system only works when you have a virtuous, intelligent, well-read people.
He said that. Virtuous. I think you'll find that if you, and I've talked about this in the past, Washington, Madison, Franklin, Jefferson have all used the word virtuous.
Yes.
And our nation doesn't exist unless the people exhibit virtue.
Yes.
And that's what Adams was giving us.
Yes.
And you've got to have a virtuous people. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Yes.
Now, all this writing, all this system doesn't work without virtue.
Yes.
It's like self-interest. We've got to put self-interest aside and put in place personal responsibility.
Yes.
And I think that's the virtue that we seek in order to keep our nation together. We need to raise awareness to that. We need to challenge people to be virtuous. We may even have to give examples of virtuosity in order for others to understand.
Well, that's what history is, isn't it? It is examples of virtuosity. That's the whole point of history.
Yes.
And I love this idea of virtue, but also this idea of knowledge. It doesn't matter how great all these documents are if we have a people that can no longer read and understand what they're saying.
Yeah.
There has to be a basic sense of knowledge and of literary understanding. One of the things I often think about is, as you see, and you and I have talked this a lot, in America as a whole, there's the denigration of the humanities and of history.
Oh, yeah.
Other countries don't do that, right? Here in America, you can get a bachelor's degree and take one history class. In Russia, it's 8 for any bachelor's degree. I think it was Karl Marx who made the statement, which I hate quoting Marx, but I'm using this for a reason. He made the statement that people devoid of their history are easily controlled.
I couldn't agree more.
Think about that. Why is it in America that we no longer teach much history, we no longer teach much humanities, we no longer teach much classical studies? Because when we can critically think through these things and we understand our people, we understand our heritage, we understand that virtue, what comes from that, that's one of the things that helps us keep our system in place.
Amen. I agree with you.
We're preaching to the choir, right?
Well, and higher education plays that role. I mean, K through 12 plays that role. But
Yes.
yet and even a history class can be something as innocuous as the history of basket weaving. I don't know. It doesn't matter.
Underwater basket weaving.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be American history
Yeah.
anymore. And that's where I think we're failing this next generation in not allowing them to understand and develop virtuous habits.
Yeah, 3-4 generations from now, what happens when we don't know who Washington is?
Yeah.
I mean, even think about this podcast that you and I are doing, which I'm thoroughly enjoying. When we get to some of those middle presidents,
Miller Fillmore.
yeah, Garfield.
Yeah, James K. Garfield.
Like, I mean, I teach history at a collegiate level, and some of these guys, I'm scratching my head going, I don't think I've ever had a course ever dedicated to them. We're going back and like pulling up their letters and going to these sites and trying to read through their life again because no one remembers. No one remembers, and honestly, no one cares on some of these. I know.
And at the time and place in history when they were there, that was the most important thing.
That's cool.
And they had a reason to be there. We need to understand why.
Yes.
And what their contribution was.
Yes.
Whether it was positive, was it negative? Let us learn from it.
Yes. I believe you made the statement before that political capital is the
most appreciable asset in the world?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. And as you said, I like that. They were the most powerful person in the world at that time. At the snap of their fingers, they could control most of the geopolitics of the world, and now we couldn't even tell you who they were married to,
You're
or
right.
how long they were in office,
Right.
or anything else. So these people were there for a reason, and sometimes we just learn from how horrible they did the job, right?
Yeah.
Some of these people, you learn how not to do things.
Yeah. Andrew Johnson.
Yeah, exactly. But there's something to be said of that, right? I think last podcast we talked about this, a wise man learns from the mistakes of others, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, so that's one of the points of history. We said this last week. It is not only prescriptive. A lot of times history is simply descriptive.
Yes.
It tells us what happened, and then we glean from it. We find those areas that are off, and then we don't want to follow that again.
I agree.
So Adams... again, just what a brilliant mind. Stepping out of the shadow of Washington. I always think about Moses and Joshua. And the book of Joshua opens up, it says, "Now Moses, my servant, was dead." And the very next word to Joshua is, "Don't be afraid." Because you're taking over a position out of Moses. And I think about that with Adams. Adams stepping after Washington, and it's almost that saying, "Don't be afraid." You're having to step in some shoes that are literally too big for you.
Yes.
And figuratively too big for you. But it was his mind. And again, God raised up a person for every time, a man and a woman for every time for leadership. And God raised up Adams for this time period. Yep. Washington couldn't have done it.
You're right.
He was the man for the time of the job. So the question is, as we look to the future, God's raising up some new leaders, some new men, some new women, and we need to support them and help them get into positions of leadership to be a virtuous nation again.
I'm committed to doing that. But I will tell you one of the things, and Hollywood could not write the script any better, that on his deathbed.
Oh, I like this.
50 years to the day.
Yes.
Him and Jefferson.
Yes.
Both passed away.
Yes.
And Jefferson preceded him.
Yes.
Yes. And Adams was disappointed because he thought that he was not going to survive Jefferson, and he did.
Yes. July 4th.
July 4th, 50 years to the day.
And I believe it's David McCullough who makes a statement. He said if Hollywood were to write this, they would say it was overdone because the cannons are shooting like in celebration of July 4th as he's dying, and then it begins to rain. Like it sounds like a cheesy Hallmark movie.
It does, but it's reality.
It is reality.
I love that.
I do too.
Call it coincidence, call it divine intervention. I don't know. Call it what you want, but it's true.
Yes.
And I like that.
Yes. So today we've been talking about Adams, one of the most brilliant minds
absolutely
of the American presidents. And next week we'll pick up on Thomas Jefferson. Probably the two. Those are the two brilliant minds, right? I think of all the presidents, those are the two minds.
Yes.
You have Jefferson, you have Adams. So next week we will continue on looking at Jefferson.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.